Hey everyone, welcome back to another video in my series 5-Point Politics. Today I'm going to be going into the role of government and how each of the 5 political types views responsibilities of the government. You may have heard people throw out fallacies like, Democrats want the government to put everyone on welfare, or Republicans support socialism for the rich. It's no secret that Republicans and Democrats disagree on some issues, but I wanted to crack this open a little wider and take a more broad approach to this issue of what everyone even thinks the role of the government is from a big picture perspective. So I'll be diving into each type, take a flyby glance at some economic systems, because once you get a sense of that, you'll have a better idea of where each perspective is coming from. Without further ado, let's get started. First, we'll go over Republicans. The government must preserve individual liberty by observing constitutional limitations, limited government intervention, fiscal responsibility, and budgetary restraints. Laws should be put in place to avoid chaos and destruction and to achieve order, without which our country would fall apart. Next, let's look at Democrats. The government must preserve individual liberty by observing constitutional limitations, equality-centered economic intervention, fiscal responsibility, and budgetary restraints. Laws and welfare should be put in place to avoid societal breakdowns. Now, you might say that it sounds remarkably similar to Republicans, and you are right. There are a few key differences, though, which can have a wide effect on the overall outcome of legislation pushed by Democrats as opposed to Republicans. The main difference between these two is on the topic of economic intervention. Both Republicans and Democrats are supporters of capitalism, an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. And if they could, both parties would work to keep things that way. You will hardly see mainstream Republican or Democratic politicians call for more cooperatives, a business run by democracy, or jump to support unions, which increases the say among workers through shared bargaining power. The function of capitalism is that a few people will become wealthy, and therefore most will not. Democrats and Republicans both push for this form of economy, arguing that it is the mad scramble for the top that creates industry and innovation. Where they differ slightly is on how many regulations they think are warranted for our economy. Capitalism functions essentially on a scale determined by how few restrictions the market has and what economic rules are placed on businesses, ranging from a totally unrestricted economy on the right to a 100% planned economy on the left. Needless to say, Democrats and Republicans do not align on many of these issues, but they aren't as far apart as they would have us believe. To examine this, I wanted to take a look at capitalism on a scale. We'll start at the furthest right, unrestricted capitalism, and move left since the far right side of the spectrum will be more familiar to most of my Western audience, and then move left piece by piece. See if you can find yourself on this list and let me know in the comments below where you are. Let's first take a look at the farthest right example. This side would be considered the free market, unrestricted capitalism, or unregulated capitalism, which means that people and their legal extensions would be unrestricted in their trading of products and labor by any government entity. The proponents of unrestricted capitalism argue for the democracy of the dollar, which is basically the idea that several companies competing in a space will make decisions, and then people will respond to these decisions by choosing to buy their product / pay for their labor or not. For instance, let's say that there are 2 competing grocery stores. The first one says that they will pay all of their workers a starting wage of $25 an hour, and the other says that they will only pay their starting employees $13 an hour. It is to be expected that a lemon might be more expensive at the first store than the second, and so potential shoppers would face a choice. Do they support the company paying more per hour and in turn pay more themselves, or support the company paying less per hour and in turn spend less? The idea is that the consumer gets to decide how they spend their dollar, so they are given a democratic choice. Now let's dip our toes into a regulated economy. An element of unrestricted capitalism is that if there is money to be gained through any means, someone will try to go for it. Let's look at vape pens, for example. The FDA found in 2018 that about 20% of high schoolers had used vape pens in the last 30 days, and that number is probably underreported if anything. In theory, there could be quite a high market in high schools for vape pens, and in an unrestricted capitalistic country, there is nothing stopping vape pen companies from targeting digital ads to youth. However, most people would point out that nicotine use at a young age can cause some issues, and would advocate that the monetary gains are not worth what we lose morally. A restriction on cigarettes would be an example of something that's supported by people that fall on the right side of a regulated economy. Let's inch a little bit further towards the center. A critique of capitalism is that in order to have democracy of the dollar, there has to be a certain level of income that's guaranteed to the workers so that they have a choice to make in the first place. For example, let's imagine that capitalism is allowed to do what it will, and you as a worker are faced with a job choice between awesome job A that pays $10 a day, or terrible job B that pays $15 a day, and your monthly rent payment is $225 a month. If you multiply $10 per day times 5 days per week times 4 weeks per month, you find that you earn only $200 total in a month at job A. On the other hand, if you do the same math for job B, you end up making $300 a month. In this case, though you are presented with two competing job offers, you don't really have a choice at all. Job A simply cannot afford you the ability to live in your space, and so you have to choose job B. This is presented as a choice, but the decision has been made by your circumstances. In order to give consumers some buying power, the minimum wage was proposed, which says that companies cannot pay under a certain amount to their workers so that the workers themselves can make decisions as capitalism would like people to be able to. Similarly, this zone would also include provisions for government care for the elderly, disabled, currently laid off, etc. for the same reasons as what I've stated above. People will obviously argue over what they think the minimum wage rate or other welfare benefits should be, but general acceptance of these principles would place people in this zone. Let's now take a look at the middle. A country here would have morality-based restrictions on what companies can and can't do, a minimum wage, welfare benefits, and let's say a few other pieces of economic intervention. These countries might examine portions of industry that are privately owned and compare them to what would happen if the ownership was transferred to the citizens instead, aka nationalization. Perhaps this country would transfer healthcare insurance to public ownership by having the government pay for every service, or maybe they would set up publicly funded schools, including higher education, or even consider a level of guaranteed infrastructure, such as laying public internet lines. Plenty of countries fall into this category, including Norway, Sweden, Finland, Denmark, the UK, Australia, etc. Most European countries would find themselves somewhere in this zone, on their own scale in the middle of this spectrum. If you are curious about more beliefs of this type of middle group, I would recommend researching Social Democrats, a group I'm not specifically covering in 5-Point Politics, but one that has some interesting beliefs. Now let's go rapid fire for these next two. Next up would probably have strict CEO pay caps in addition to everything I've mentioned before, higher taxes on capital gains, making more things nationalized like utilities, universities, etc. They would probably also have additional welfare support, especially for necessities like food and shelter. They may even advocate for a universal basic income so that everyone has the ability to make choices in the market. If we inch further towards a planned economy, let's say that the government also declared that every company must meet a certain level of democracy within the workplace. This would essentially turn every business that wasn't already a public entity into a cooperative. Workers would elect their managers, their union representatives, and vote to set their own wages and benefits. If there is a recession, they could all opt for a pay cut and a cut in hours so that the business could continue to function and they could continue to work. Currently, there are around 250 worker-owned cooperatives in the US, and they are even more popular overseas in many European countries. If you are curious to learn more about cooperatives, a link will be put down in the description below for more info. Finally, let's take a look at what a theoretical 100% planned economy might look like. Proponents of this believe that democracy means one person equals one vote, and in a system where money is counted as votes, such as an unrestricted capitalistic system, there is no democracy since some people have significantly more votes than others by design. Instead, they advocate for democracy within the workplace to allow workers to run things since they know them best instead of CEOs and board members that might have vested financial interest, but who do not typically depend solely on the business in order to pay for their food and shelter. In this example, a government might require that all businesses be turned over to them to be run by democratically elected members entirely for the benefit of the public. First off, this would appear in the form of mergers for the sake of efficiency. Instead of several different companies such as Hasbro, Mattel, Melissa & Doug, and Lego, there would be one toy-making division of the government. Similarly, instead of several different companies competing for space, film rights, and engineers to work for Six Flags, Disney's Park Division, SeaWorld, and Cedar Fair, there would instead be a theme parks division of the government. In theory, this would allow for the maximum amount of vertical integration, since you would have one CEO instead of 4 in each of those examples, and one team of marketers instead of 4, etc. In theory, a planned or command economy that functions properly would be the most efficient economy when it comes down to a comparison of cost versus benefits. Not only that, but everything from managers to janitors to CEOs would be elected, and any profit would be handed straight over to the government, and from that pile, the government would in turn then pay their workers. Presumably, since citizens would be working for these divisions, electing their peers and giving back to the community, everything would be low cost or free for citizens, and everyone would be required to work fewer hours since so many jobs would shrink or become obsolete. If any country switched to this, functions of the government would be free or low cost to citizens, as I said before, but they could charge non-citizens if they still wanted to participate in today's current international economy. Everything past the middle mark on the left half would be considered socialism, and everything on the right half would be considered capitalism. Nothing on either end of the extremes exists in reality currently, to my knowledge, but they could in theory. You have probably guessed this by now, but Democrats and Republicans, though similar, would exist along the right side of the plane, with Democrats mostly taking this tick and Republicans mostly taking this one. Now that we've covered some of the different types of economies, we can hop on back to the main video. Here's what a socialist might say. The government should guarantee the well-being of its citizens through equity-centered economic and workplace intervention. Laws, welfare, and social programs should be in place to ensure social harmony, equity, and order. The main economic goal of socialists is to eliminate the existence of an owning class and create rough equality of ownership. Going back to our favorite graph, I would place socialists right here. Here's what a libertarian might say. The government should stay out of the way of its people and all legal extensions of them, so that private enterprise can run its natural course of selecting winners and losers without external intervention. Government should provide only the most basic of necessities, which feasibly can't be done by the free market. Generally, this means road maintenance and a small military. Depending on how close to the principles of true libertarianism they find themselves, they may additionally include police, firefighters, EMTs, and 911 operators. I'd put our libertarian friends right about here. Here's what a communist might say. The government should guarantee the well-being of its citizens by allowing the workers to seize the means of production and all companies to run them like a library or public utility. Everything will be run democratically by committees or unions as a benefit to the people. Laws and social programs should be put in place to ensure the social harmony and order. As you can probably guess, I'd put communists right here. Alright, that ended up being a long one. Thank you all for watching. I hope that you were able to take something away from this. Also, shout out to Hannah for helping me with the graphics on this video, and Grant for his help with teaching me how to do some editing. You can find Grant's account in the description below. As always, have a wonderful day.